The US Navy is 10 times as powerful as everybody else is put together. And that's one of the reasons why globalization works. The US Navy is omnipresent on the high seas. But remove that, and the security that is necessary for large-scale civilian shipping goes away. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have heard the scuttlebutt that the Chinese have even a bigger navy in terms of ships than the United States. This is the Shandong. This is their new aircraft carrier. And in terms of number of ships, that is true. But to be perfectly honest, sometimes it is about size. Most Chinese vessels are tiny. So the Shandong here, the US has 10 carriers that size. They're the core of our marine expeditionary units. In addition, the United States has 11 super carriers, each of which independently has at least 5 times the capacity of the Shandong. I mean, there's no competition here. So the Chinese might be able to control the seas within a couple hundred miles of their coast, but that's it, because 90% of their vessels can't sail more than 1,000 miles from home. So from a security point of view, it's laughable to think that the Chinese could maintain a regional trade order, much less a global trade order, much less displace the United States. It's just not on the cards. But then there's demographics. The Chinese have gone through the same problems that everybody else in the world has. Here's a demographic profile back in 1980. Lots and lots of young people. This is one of the reasons why Mao put in the one-child policy. You fast forward to the year 2000, and they're in that magical moment. Lots of consumption-led, lots of young labor can export. But a few things are in the process of evolving. First, all those young people have now aged, so the consumption-led low production period is over. Second, all those young adults didn't have very many kids because of one child. Now, in the short term, that actually helps the numbers, because if you're spending money on things like condos and pizza and vacations, that generates a lot more follow-on growth than doing it on diapers and milk. But 20 years later, you're no longer in your 20s and your 30s, you're in your 40s and your 50s, and there are no kids coming up to replace you. And the consumption pulse that you see collapses. And then third, China cannibalized the countryside to fuel urban activity. You can only do that until you run out of people. Now, in the United States, the urbanization process was slow. It took 2 centuries. The Chinese did it in 35 years. So that process does generate amazing levels of growth, and that's what we know as the panda boom. But it's a moment in time, and you can only do it once, and it's over. And here's where the Chinese demography is today. China has not simply aged out of its demographic moment. It has aged past the point of any even theoretical demographic recovery. And it is hitting their economy at every level. Here's some average labor costs for some Southeast Asian nations that I think will actually do pretty well in the world to come. Here's Mexico, very competitive, right in the middle of the pack. And here's the PRC, 11-fold increase in labor prices in 20 years. It's the fastest labor inflation ever recorded anywhere in human history. China can no longer function as a low-cost or even a mid-cost manufacturing center. And they don't have the skill set to go higher. But it's also hitting consumption. When a country develops, there's certain things that everybody wants, and the order is the same everywhere. Number 1, they want a cell phone. Number 2, they want a refrigerator. Number 3, they want a car. Well, I would argue to ignore that last bar in January of 2020, because in that month, China had their coronavirus lockdown, and I don't think anyone should be judged on their worst day. China, supposedly this up-and-coming economy that's going to take over the world, can't even generate car sales while it's at its consumption peak. It's simple math. Most people purchase their first car in their 20s, and China has 40% fewer 20-somethings than 30-somethings. The population is in a state of collapse. The sell to China play is nearly over just by the numbers. And that assumes nothing goes wrong with politics. The hateful propaganda that we have seen out of the PRC is not an accident. It isn't purely for the domestic audience. It is expressly designed to generate a backlash to help justify the CCP crackdown that is occurring at home, and not just in Hong Kong and not just in Xinjiang. Now, strategically, the CCP has decided that part and parcel of this is that China will never again purchase any American foodstuffs unless there are no other options on the market. The Chinese market was never the promised land that many thought. It was always running on a sugar high. And now, for political reasons in China, the market is closing until such time as China itself breaks. And you need to come to terms with that. This market is going to be gone until the China that we've come to know is also gone. And I don't expect any significant shifts in policy on either side. First, with the elections here in the United States, it became a contest over who could be more anti-Chinese. We have entered a sharply anti-Chinese phase politically, left, right, and center, that is going to run for years at the same time that the Chinese are experiencing system-breaking challenges. Second, there is zero hope for an improvement in relations. If anyone could theoretically steer the relationship in a more cooperative direction, it was former Iowa governor and former ambassador to China, Terry Branstad. He's the guy toasting China in the bottom left there. He met Xi back in the 1980s, I think 1984, when Xi was on an agricultural exchange program that came to Iowa when Branstad was a young governor. They hit it off. They became friends. Branstad, of course, was governor of Iowa for like 175 terms, longest serving American governor in history. And eventually, when Trump became president, he tapped Branstad to be his representative in Beijing. And he did, in my opinion, an excellent job. But in the last 3 years, it's become obvious that the people who want a more cooperative relationship have been steadily stymied on both sides. So Branstad tried to put together an op-ed to this point and publish it, and the Chinese immediately blacklisted him. And realizing there was nothing he could do, Branstad resigned back in October. Branstad was Trump's only conduit to Xi. Everyone else has quit, fired, or been marginalized. And he's broadly representative of the status of the relationship in general. Those who want a good relationship have been shut out, and those who don't are the ones who are now in charge. Biden has not indicated at this point who his point man in China would be, but the folks on his national security team writ large have no meaningful specific expertise on the topic, so don't expect much. Third, despite China's official recovery from coronavirus, its economy is reeling. Remember, we've got lower global demand from the consuming economies. We've got retooling across the world as people try to bring manufacturing in-house. Their export orders have dried up. So what growth we've seen has been mostly inventory builds. And that reminds me a lot of the lead up to the Asian financial crisis back in 1997. And we're just not going to see a meaningful negotiation. The Chinese made Trump look the fool with the phase one stuff. They broke that deal the day after it was approved, and they're now at roughly 25% of where they need to be in order to meet the supposed goals. And Biden's proclaimed policies suggest an even harder line for at least the first year. His whole Rebuild America, Buy America programs basically say that if there's a product out there that is made in the United States or abroad, the U.S. government will only purchase the locally made one. And if there is no locally made one, the U.S. will find some money to help build out the supply chains for building it here in the United States. And as anti-Chinese as that is, it's actually even worse.